Hello, I apologize for being late. What happens is as soon as the meetings are done, it has to convert it into a video. And for some reason that takes about 10 minutes, which is why I put 10 minutes between each class. So even if I go like a minute or two over, what happens is that then that goes into that 10 minutes and it gets me late for the next class. So what I might do next week is I might put 15 minutes between each class. So hopefully I'll avoid this in the future being late for people. So I appreciate you being here. I'm just going to unmute all of you since there's only two of you here. That won't be too big a distraction. You guys doing okay?
Yeah, how are you?
Well, not too bad.
Yep. Good.
Okay, let's bring up, well, Leonie,
Yeah,
I have to get the video of the presentation out yesterday because you know what we started talking about yesterday?
I looked into those videos on your YouTube channel
Yeah.
and
I don't have yesterday's out there yet though.
Oh, okay. Yeah, then I didn't see him.
I ran into a problem converting a video yesterday, and I've sent a help desk message to Zoom for help correcting that, but I didn't. But do you recognize this picture?
Yeah, that was like the one that was on there, like the last one.
Okay, so but yesterday is when I actually started talking about it. What is it a picture of?
Looks like Wilhelm.
Yes.
Yeah.
Frederick Wilhelm, and the guy in white is?
I can't tell you that. I don't know.
Otto von Bismarck.
Oh, yeah, that makes sense.
And where are they?
I'm not sure.
Leonie, man, I thought you'd kill this because this is all German history.
I know. I'm sorry.
They're in the Palace of Versailles in Paris.
Gotcha. Well, I know that like Bismarck is like the vice president.
Yes. Well,
like,
he was the chancellor.
Okay.
And this is, do you know what historical event is happening right now in this picture?
I don't. I'm sorry.
But no, that's quite all right because it gives me something to teach about. I thought you'd be all over this though because this is all, again, German history. So anyway, this is actually what I started talking about yesterday, and I'm going to finish up talking about today. So as a result of the German Confederation and you know the fight between Prussia and Austria over who's going to lead this confederation, and again, what the German Confederation was all these little principalities that today make up Germany, and then Austria, kind of, hey, we all speak German. We've all got, you know, this shared heritage and culture and language. Maybe we should ally ourselves together into something. And that's where the German Confederation comes from. Again, it's not a united Germany as a country. It's a bunch of little countries who decide we're all going to work together, basically. And Otto von Bismarck was appointed the Chancellor of Prussia. And once he was appointed, he set out to strengthen and improve the Prussian army and gain international allies that would help Prussia on its way to unifying all these German principalities and city-states into one nation. Now, after gaining the chancellorship in 1862, he began improving Prussia's diplomatic position to ensure Prussia's dominance over Austria. Prussia and Austria are the two big contenders and technical leaders of the German Confederation. And the German states start dividing up, going, okay, we're going to follow the lead of Austria or we're going to follow the lead of Prussia. And this becomes kind of like almost like political parties almost. So in 1863, when Russia experienced a revolt in its Polish territory, Bismarck and Prussia supported Russia in its violent suppression of the rebellion. And this endeared Prussia to Russia, who was traditionally an ally of Prussia's German rival, Austria. So if all this contention over the leadership did lead to war, now they didn't have to worry about a two-front war, because if Austria called on their ally Russia to come to them, that would cause two fronts they would have to fight on. Now they've eliminated Russia from the war, and they only have to focus on a front with Austria. So the neutralization of Russian interests in German affairs came in handy just a few short years later when this actually happened. After Bismarck encouraged the uprising of German nationalists in Schleswig and Holstein and wrested the two territories from Denmark in the 1864 Danish War, Prussia turned its eyes on Austria. Austria had joined the Danish War in the hopes that they could supplant Prussia as the defender of German nationalists, but only succeeded in becoming entwined in the defense of territory which was far away from its home in South Central Europe. In other words, they were wasting troop resources, sending them, clear across, the continent to fight in a war that really didn't matter any much except for prestige. So indeed, after the Danish War, Austria and Prussia were considered joint defenders of Schleswig and Holstein. Once ruled by the Danes, who speak Danish, Schleswig and Holstein, they speak German. They have more connections to Germany than they do to the Danish people. And in order for Austria to defend the two principalities, it had to cross Prussian territory. Prussia denied Austria the right to do so. And when the rest of the Confederation supported Austria, Bismarck declared the Confederation defunct. And so instead of trying to fight for the leadership of the Confederation, he's like, well, you guys want to side with Austria? Okay, do that. We're done. The Confederation doesn't exist anymore. Prussia is going to just lead you guys by force. And he declared war on Austria, and he invaded other northern German lands. And the ensuing conflict lasted only 7 weeks, and Prussia defeated Austria resoundingly, due in part to both diplomacy and military superiority. Prussia at this time has one of the greatest armies in the world. Matter of fact, other armies in the world are looking at the Prussian model, and the Prussian model of military science is still the predominant philosophy of militaries today, but it was developed there in Prussia. And indeed, Prussia possessed a better trained and better equipped army than the Austrians, but it was Prussia's neutralization of Austria's potential ally of Russia due to Prussian help in the Polish Rebellion, and France due to Prussia's promise of territory that really made Prussia's victory advantageous. Additionally, Prussia guaranteed the new kingdom of Italy that we talked about yesterday, the Austrian-controlled territory of Venice, and in doing so, gained a strategic ally south of Austria, which forced Austria to divide its troops and fight a two-front war itself. So after defeating Austria, Bismarck was strategically lenient with the Austrians. Again, the Austrians speak German. They have a German heritage. I mean, they were the seat of the Holy Roman Empire for a lot of its existence. And so you don't want to alienate them, because then other Germans might go, listen, we're really more with them and you're kind of alienating us. So be very lenient with them, welcome them back under your leadership, of course, but don't be too harsh on them, because it's like, killing your brother. The rest of the family ain't going to like you. But if you just beat him up a little bit, maybe, they can live with that. So as his plans for a pan-German nation might be hurt if he dealt too severely with the German state. So instead, he merely annexed Schleswig, Holstein, and other German land to Prussia and unified North Germany into a new confederation, thereby shutting Austria nearly entirely out of regional power. So with Austria neutralized, the final obstacle to Prussia's unification of Germany was France. France held a lot of southern German lands under their protection, if not within their own state, people where the primary language was German. And places such as Alsace and Lorraine, where there are lots of natural resources for an industrial society, such as coal. So France still controlled territory on the border of the new Prussian-dominated German Confederation, which Prussia considered German, for those reasons that I just said. Moreover, France was equally ambitious to expand eastward into German lands, and simultaneously was worried about the growth of Prussian power at its doorstep. France had historically been the big power on the continent. No one except for maybe Spain and Austria could have competed with them, and now Spain and Austria are two very weak states. But Prussia is growing as a result, so France just doesn't have total security. It's not like they can sit back and go, whew, we don't have any enemies that we have to worry about, because Prussia is now on their doorstep and gaining power. And again, that competition over Alsace and Lorraine and those resources was getting kind of intense. So moreover, France, like I said, very anxious to expand eastward and worried about the growth of Prussian power. To provoke war, Bismarck released the now famous Ems telegram, which appeared to insult the France ambassador and France itself. And so the French, all this nationalistic pride, Vive la France, were really upset. And so they declared war. Napoleon III, the nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte, who now is in charge of the French Empire, declared war on Prussia in the summer of 1870. And what you get is known as the Franco-Prussian War. And this is going to prove a grave mistake for the French. After only 6 weeks, the better supplied and well-organized Prussian military had defeated the French, captured its main army, including Napoleon III at Sedan. And after a siege of Paris, the Prussians marched into the French capital in January 1871, victorious. Now, this sounds simple enough. Hey, Prussian military, they do good. They invade France. They beat France. They capture Paris. Then they leave, and they leave the French to their own devices. War over. Everybody's good. The psychological ramifications for the French people, though, are humongous. They cannot forget the Germans marching in the streets of Paris. And so in World War I, when they defeat the Germans, they want revenge, and they're super harsh on them. And so when World War II comes, what does Hitler want? He wants to embarrass the French and take Paris again from them. And we'll get into all that. But the psychological ramifications of the Franco-Prussian War, the Franco-Prussian War is the cause of World War I, in my opinion. And World War I is the cause of World War II. So, I mean, a lot of things are happening. This might seem like just a small conflict between people far away, but this war has huge ramifications, and the capture of Paris, is kind of the beginnings of this. So the war did more for Prussia than simply gain the territory considered German, and mainly Alsace and Lorraine. In the build-up to the war, the southern German states outside the Federation asked to join the Confederation out of fear of French attack. And with all this territory now in Prussian control and its borders secure, at the Palace of Versailles, when they invaded Paris, Bismarck got all these states together in the Confederation, and the Confederation voted to combine into one country under the King of Prussia, Wilhelm I, and he was named the Kaiser, or Caesar, the Emperor of Germany, a new state. So the ceremony took place in Versailles, like I said, the traditional seat of French power, which further humiliated the French. So this is yes, Josh, I'm sorry.
So I guess, does Prussia now no longer exist? It's Germany now?
Yes, Prussia is just another state in Germany.
Okay.
Now, of course, at that time, it wasn't a federated republic like the United States. It was they had regions basically all under the Kaiser. So Prussia, Wilhelm I was the King of Prussia and the Emperor of Germany. And then they had all these other little states that had princes and kings. Everybody kept their noble title, but they answered, just like when they answered to the Holy Roman Emperor, now they answer to the Emperor of Germany.
Okay.
If that makes sense. So now this is the creation of the Germany we know today, basically.
Yeah.
Now, what happened to the other rival of the Confederation, the guys who were cut out, Austria? Well, now they're kind of on their own. And so instead of looking westward towards the German states and being their leader, they start looking more eastward towards Hungary. As an analogy, high school is a rough time in a kid's life. Friends are made, cliques are formed, exclusionary games can be played by the meaner members of a group. And in the scramble to unite the German lands in the mid-19th century, Austria got forced out of any resulting German state after a war with Prussia in 1866. And just like a spurned group member in high school, it was forced to form its own clique. Austria had been a member state of the Holy Roman Empire for centuries, most of that time its leader. And by the beginning of the early modern period, the Austrian ruling family, the Habsburgs, traditionally controlled the imperial throne. After the 30 Years' War ended in 1648, the emperorship, if you recall, lost most of its traditional power over the affairs of other German states. And in turn, the Austrian Habsburgs began to focus on exerting control over the territory it directly controlled in South Central Europe. And by the beginning of the 18th century, Austria controlled much of its surrounding territory, including Silesia, Bohemia, parts of Hungary. And in the 18th century, as the influence of the Holy Roman Empire continued to wane, Austria's power in Central Europe rose in tandem with the power of a northern German state, Prussia, that we just talked about. In fact, the two burgeoning German countries fought two wars in the middle of the 18th century, the War of the Austrian Succession and the 7 Years' War, which is the French and Indian War here in America, in which Austria lost Silesia to Prussia. And the two states were both defeated and conquered by Napoleon in the early 19th century, and after Napoleon's defeat were the two principal powers of the German Confederation that was formed in 1815. Austria and Prussia vied for control of the loosely affiliated confederation, and in 1866, Prussia refused Austrian troops entry to cross Prussian territory, and Prussia subsequently declared war on Austria. And despite having the support of most of the Confederation, Austria was soundly defeated by the better trained and better equipped Prussian military. And as a result, Prussia formed a new German Confederation that specifically excluded territories directly ruled by Austria. So exclusion from the now Prussia-controlled German Confederation left Austria in an economic and political crisis. As a result, it turned to consolidate power in its territories held outside of the reach of the soon-to-be united Germany. Austria had controlled parts of Hungary since Austria's rise to regional prominence in the 17th century, and those parts have been a continual source of intermittent rebellion against the Austrian monarchy. And instead of opting for a costly campaign that would have further reduced the already alien Austrian treasury, the Austrian emperor at the time, Francis Joseph, chose to negotiate with the Magyar families that had traditionally ruled. Yeah, the Huns were a very tribal society, and Hungary continued to be like that. And the Magyars were like the chieftains. I don't know if they traditionally had a royal title. It's not like, you know, it might have been son inherited from father and everything, but it was kind of agreed upon by the tribe that would go on like that. So the Magyars, very interesting historical study, how they operated. But the Magyar families had traditionally ruled Hungarian lands, and they kind of came together and elected Franz Joseph as their, king. In 1867, the two parties of the Magyars and the royalty of Austria signed the Ausgleich, literally the compromise. Am I pronouncing that correctly, Oni?
Ausgleich, yeah.
Okay. And it acknowledged the Austrian Emperor Franz Joseph. I keep saying Franz because that's what it is in German. And Francis Joseph's the English of it. They acknowledged him as King of Hungary and granted him control of all of the territory in the Balkans and Eastern Europe under Hungarian control, which used to be under Ottoman control. But remember, the Ottomans are now that old sick man of Europe. And now, he's the king of Hungary, but he has to rule Hungary separately from Austria. In other words, he can't combine their treasuries and their armies. He rules Hungary and he rules Austria. And in return for being proclaimed king of Hungary, Franz Joseph was forced to make radical reforms to the Austrian government as a result. He agreed to not implement any new laws amending the basic Austrian constitution without first consulting the Austrian Representative Assembly, the Reichsrat. Furthermore, rather than forcing Hungary to send representatives to the Reichsrat, Franz Joseph instead granted Hungary greater control over its own affairs, allowing the region to have its own parliament that was not beholden to anything the central Austrian parliament decided. So think of it as Canada and the United Kingdom. Queen Elizabeth is the queen of the United Kingdom. She's also the queen of Canada, but they're separate countries. They have their own parliaments and so forth. They rule themselves separately. So indeed, the new empire of Austria-Hungary was only united dynastically in matters of war and foreign policy. Other concessions were made to appease the liberals in the Austrian Reichsrat who opposed the creation of the dual monarchy. Freedom of religion, access to primary education, and a modicum of other personal freedoms that we take for granted here in the United States were granted, and the protection from persecution of Hungary's German-speaking minority was secured. Perhaps the most important effect that the creation of the dual monarchy of Austria-Hungary had was the quelling of unrest in Austria's Hungarian possessions for at least a few decades. They seemed satisfied. They were independent of these German-speaking people. They could live their own lives, their own culture, and they had a king that was their own, even though he happened to also be the king of a German-speaking province. They were two separate things. And indeed, Hungary had been a continual source of internal insurrection in Habsburg land since it first gained territory there in the late medieval period. So this was a welcome respite. Furthermore, the creation of the monarchy actually brought even more territory under control of the Austrian crown, and thereby gave the new empire greater military might and increased international influence. So everything they lost in the creation of Germany, they kind of gained by looking again eastward and building up a powerhouse there. In nature, I don't, you may be aware of this from biology class or something, but several species of spiders actually eat their mothers after hatching. And though gruesome as this may be, it's not unlike the relationship some enlightened and or reforming monarchs in early modern history have had with their political programs. If you let people have too much power, that's going to reduce your power as a monarch. And this is especially true for Russia. The more freedoms or rights that were granted in Russia, the more the people were likely to use their freedoms to cry for more. And this was certainly the case in 19th century Russia for the ruler in the mid-19th century, Tsar Alexander II. Alexander II saw himself as an enlightened monarch, and he wanted to grant a lot of freedoms to his people. And so he enacted widespread and sweeping reforms, most notably ending serfdom in Russia. Russia is the last country in Europe to actually end serfdom. But as a result of all this, he actually was assassinated by a group of nationalist terrorists who wanted even more rights. So Alexander II had become Tsar in 1855 after the death of his father, Nicholas I. And at 36, Alexander had been groomed to rule, but no amount of study could adequately prepare him for the crisis Russia was in when he took the throne. In 1855, Russia was in the midst of the debilitating Crimean War against Great Britain, France, and the Ottoman Empire on southern Russian soil that I talked about yesterday. Not only did Russia lose hundreds of millions of citizens and soldiers in the effort because their army was under-equipped and very poorly trained, but they lost the war as well. And while Russia lost territory in the Balkans and was also forced to remove any Russian naval presence from the Black Sea, their only warm water port, remember I talked about how the geography of Russia makes it so important for them to have a warm water port. The humiliation of losing to 3 foreign powers in Russia itself likely hurt the worst, hurt their pride. The failure made Alexander realize that Russia could not compete militarily or economically with the great European powers of the 19th century. And that was kind of the motivation for him to modernize Russia, including giving them more enlightened government and giving them a lot more freedoms. So a lot of these countries had undergone massive industrialization in the past century, and their armies were equipped with the fruits of this process. More technologically advanced weaponry that could be produced at a cheaper cost. Russia, on the other hand, still had a mainly agricultural, serf-based economy, which could not pay for the cost of large-scale 19th century warfare. So Tsar Alexander realized the importance of industrializing if Russia would again be able to consider itself a major player in the international arena. He realized the importance of this in order to create the labor pool necessary for advanced industrial production. And so he resolved to end serfdom in Russia so these people could move. Remember, a serf is someone who belongs to the land. So by ending serfdom, people could leave their farms and estates, not be the property of the land, and go work in cities and factories and things like this. So it became the last country in Europe to end the feudal practice whereby the peasantry, while not slaves, were permanently tied to their landowner and their owner's lands. So Alexander's proposed reforms angered the traditional Russian landowners, the boyars, even though many provisions severely restricted the practices and movements of the 22 million newly freed serfs to kind of keep a lot of them on their estates. For example, rather than granting serfs the deeds to the land their family had farmed for generations, the former serfs were required to purchase or rent land from their former lords, so the boyars didn't lose out on any income, basically. And it often made these families far poorer than when they had actually been tied to the land as serfs. So while the logistics of ending serfdom in Russia certainly caused some strain, coupled with further reforms, Alexander strengthened the Russian economy and modernized Russian society. He built huge amounts of railroads across Russia to facilitate economic production, and Russian exports of crops and minerals skyrocketed as a result. He introduced several key measures that allowed more freedom of the press and made public education more widely available to the Russian populace. And additionally, the boost to the Russian economy allowed Alexander to pay for military reforms, including equipping Russian troops with the latest firearms and other weaponry. But if you think about this seriously, it all sounds great. But he limited the serfs. We got rid of serfdom technically, but they had to pay rent, which made their life even worse. And when we say he built all these things, he took a bunch of these people and he basically put them in slave labor to build all these things. So in other words, you're not tied to your estate anymore. You're going to be forced by the government at gunpoint to go work for a penny a day here. So you can kind of see, even though he's enlightened and he's trying to do all these better things to modernize society, it wasn't helping the people as much. And this is the main impetus in about 40 years. What's going to happen is the Russian Revolution of 1917, when the communists take over and create the Soviet Union. So Tsar Alexander's relaxation of censorship laws allowed for the proliferation of political pamphlets and rhetoric throughout the Russian Empire, some of which spurred nationalist movements like those that were occurring in Germany and Italy. For example, in 1863, a nationalist revolt took place in Russian-controlled Poland, which Alexander violently suppressed. Nationalists did not only interrupt Russian affairs, however. In the 1870s, a revolt by Bulgarian nationalists against the Ottoman Empire gave Russia an opportunity to regain influence in the Balkans it had lost during the Crimean War. Russians consider themselves Slavic, and the areas of the Balkans are where the Slavs, which is where the Romans got the root word for slave. There's just a ton of people living out in these areas that you could go and harvest as slaves. So Yugoslavia, think about Czechoslovakia, all these old countries that don't exist anymore, that have the word Slav in them. And the Russians consider themselves Slavic, and as the largest independent Slavic nation, they see themselves as the protectors of Slavic people outside of Russia. And they're going to use that excuse that we're the protectors of those, even throughout the Cold War. That's why, you can't have, you can't ally with them or have a military installation. The whole Iron Curtain is the Slavic countries, basically. And so, Russia, the Ottomans are treating them badly. They're persecuting, Orthodox Christians, which Russia is now the head of the Orthodox Christian Church, basically. And so they go, we are going to invade and take on the Ottomans. So when nationalists in Bulgaria rise up and say, we're Slavic people who don't want to be ruled by the Ottomans, the Russians are right there going, yes, we've got your back. And this is going to become important because later on, when Austria has problems with some of its Slavic peoples, Russia gets involved, and this is what starts World War I, basically. So nationalists did not only interrupt Russian affairs, however. In the 1870s, again, this revolt by Bulgarian nationalists gave Russia an opportunity to regain influence in the area. Russia supported the nationalists in the revolt and helped win Bulgaria its independence, though Russian influence was hindered by simultaneous English and Austro-Hungarian influence exerted in the region, so they had to kind of share some of the glory with the Bulgarians. So despite this military success abroad, the reforms at home have left Alexander few friends in Russia. The poor people didn't think they were getting enough freedoms. The rich people felt he was taking too much stuff away from them. So nobody liked him, basically. Intellectuals and nationalists largely felt his reforms were too few and piecemeal, while the traditional nobility were upset at the freeing of the serfs and the attacks on their traditional rights. Several attempts were made on Alexander's life before a nationalist group successfully bombed his carriage in St. Petersburg in 1881, killing the 62-year-old Tsar. Now, we're going to go back across the Atlantic to look at what's going on in the United States at this time. Canada and the United States are two countries which share many more things than other neighboring countries. And while there are major differences, French, Canada, and Los Angeles, for instance, share very little. Both countries share similar pastimes, cuisine, and they possess a shared immigrant heritage. And despite how alike the two countries are today, in the 1860s, the two countries were going in opposite directions. One tearing apart itself in civil war, that would be the United States, and the other coming together to form a whole new country. So while the American Civil War's terrible toll in the United States is well known, what is less widely discussed is the war's impact abroad, particularly in Europe. The American Civil War and the Union's success in maintaining a unified nation also scored a symbolic victory in Europe for the American Republic. When the United States first declared its independence from Great Britain, and we had that war, and we set up kind of a federal government, all the experts in Europe were like, this can't last. The power is too divided. You have to have someone strong at the head of government. You can't, divide all this power and it be successful. So when the Civil War happens, these experts in Europe are nodding their head going, see, this is what we said would happen exactly. And, we were right. So in Europe, the 19th century saw the absolute monarchies of the past slowly transform into constitutional monarchies where the king and parliament ruled in tandem. And many monarchists and political theorists felt that republics were doomed to failure, just like the French Revolution attempted republic had collapsed in less than a decade and led to Napoleon. And then when they restored the Second Republic after Napoleon died or was defeated at Waterloo, then it fell to Napoleon III. And, again, the French Republic had died and become an empire. Many felt a secession of the southern states was just a natural progression in America's hopeless attempt at a republican government. They thought we were doomed to failure. The success of the northern states in preserving a unified republic and the new constitutional interpretation of what federalism and a republic was proved this notion false. Because remember, before the Civil War, the states had primacy. We were like a club of states. But after the Civil War, the national government has primacy and the states have to answer to it. And that's the way it is today. The sides the European powers chose during the American Civil War changed the face of European geopolitics as well. Britain, who had naturally been unfriendly with the American government after the American Revolution and the War of 1812, supported the Confederacy in theory. They had a big problem with slavery. They had gotten rid of it a couple decades before. And so the fact that, we want to support the South, but really the whole thing you're fighting for is slavery, we can't really do that. So they wavered when it came to actively aiding the Southern war effort. They stated publicly, we're behind the South, but they weren't really going to help them. So despite British political interest, the British public would have heavily opposed British aid of slavery-supported regime in any state, jeopardizing stability at home. Nonetheless, Britain still nearly declared a war on the United States when a Union captain boarded a British naval vessel and seized 2 Confederate emissaries aboard. In response, the British demanded an apology and threatened war, but Lincoln was a master diplomat and worked with Great Britain. Is like, we don't want war. This is a battle between brothers here. We're going to try to keep you out of it. It was a mistake we did this. He even returned the emissaries back to the Confederate States. So serious conflict between the two nations never occurred. France, too, proved unfriendly to the Union as they had colonial ambitions in Mexico, which the U.S. heavily opposed. Matter of fact, while towards the end of the Civil War, and this is a little known historical fact, towards the end of the Civil War, France invaded Mexico. Napoleon III actually invaded Mexico. And that's where we get Cinco de Mayo, actually, is a fight between a small Mexican force and the French army where the Mexicans won. But why did the French leave? They lost one little battle, big deal. Why did they leave Mexico? Because at the end of the Civil War, we had a huge battle-hardened army of 63 million people that we planted on the Texas border and said, leave or we're coming in. And so the French goes, okay, we're going now, because there was no way they were going to win against that army with their supply line being across the Atlantic. And that's a little known fact, is that we took the Union Army and planted them in Texas at that time. So obviously, if we had not just concluded a major war and had millions of soldiers to commit, we would not have been able to force France to, leave Mexico alone. So whereas the Confederacy was non-materially supported by the major powers of Western Europe, the Union did gain a tacit ally in Tsar Alexander II's Russia. We needed grain and food and industrial supplies, and we didn't have a connection at that scale with anybody in Europe. So Russia's just not developing all this stuff. They're like, hey, guess what? We got stuff to sell. So Tsar Alexander freed Russia's serfs in 1861, and though his support of the Union had less to do with his reforming nature and more to do with Russia's mid-19th century rivalry for trade with Great Britain. Russia had lost the Crimean War on its own soil in the mid-1850s, and Russia heavily opposed increased British presence on the seas around Russian territory in the Black Sea and Baltic Seas. Russia's rivalry and the U.S.'s unfriendly disposition toward Britain made the two somewhat natural allies. And though Russia did not enter the war, many historians count Russia's friendly countenance with the Union and their industrial sales to us as one of the major reasons why Britain did not get directly involved in the Confederate cause. Because if they did, and the South lost, which everybody kind of guessed that they would, they just didn't have the manpower or the industrial capacity to win, then Russia would be the big hero to the United States and would become a major trading partner for them, cutting Great Britain out. So while the Civil War was ripping the United States apart, north of the border in British Canada, a new country was starting to come together. And this development came about largely due to 2 factors. British settlers living in Canada had long feared their southern neighbor would eventually try to conquer all of North America, per the American theory of manifest destiny. And remember, that's why we extended out to Texas and California and kicked the Mexicans out of those areas, the Spanish out of Florida, and the French, we forced them to sell Louisiana. Didn't really force, but we said that it was ours anyway. And so we were expanding across the continent and thinking God had put us here and gave us this continent. Well, don't forget Canada is part of this continent too. So Canadians are going, when are they going to start coming up here? And actually, we did invade a couple times during the War of 1812. And so this isn't, an irrational fear by the Canadians. So Canadians feared this naturally extended over the entire continent, this idea of manifest destiny. And the American Civil War worsened these fears as Canadians feared retribution for Britain's quiet support of the Confederacy, that the United States might take advantage to take some of Britain's territory to the north. So while this perceived need for a strong, united counterweight to American aggression in North America played a large part in the creation of Canada, internal factors motivated Canadians as well. Indeed, the railroads from east to west were disjointed at best, and British Canadian nationalists wanted more control over the internal affairs of the North American territories. And as a result, in March of 1867, the British Parliament passed the British North American Act, granting the remaining British territories in North America powers over roads, schools, defense, and infrastructure. In other words, the government in London said, listen, you guys can form your own local governments to handle these limited areas. So the three British territories of Canada, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, agreed and formed the Dominion of Canada on July 1st, 1867. That's kind of their Independence Day now. So signing the bill was Canada's first Prime Minister, Sir John A. Macdonald. And in the process, Canada East and Canada West split to form the provinces of Quebec and Ontario, respectively. And despite this initial union, the Canada we know today came together in a piecemeal fashion. 2 years later, the Dominion of Canada purchased Rupert's Land from the Hudson Bay Company, and this was a vast territory stretching from the Western Prairie north and east as far as Ellesmere Island and modern-day northern Quebec. In 1870, the province of Manitoba was carved out of this land and admitted to the Dominion of Canada. British Columbia joined the following year, and in 1880, Canada admitted all the remaining North American British territories and islands into the Canadian Union, with the exception of Newfoundland. Newfoundland remained separate from Canada until 1949. And that is today's lecture on kind of national unification. Did you guys have any questions or anything?
I wouldn't say question. I just thought it was kind of funny after you said it. Between, in America, we went into all this war to try and get all this land and unify stuff. And Canada just said, hey, you want to be friends? Combine? Sure. That was kind of funny.
So, Leonie, what did you learn about the unification of Germany that you didn't know?
Well, I didn't know exactly how it happened, but I'm just that confused. When did Prussia stop being a part of Germany? Was it after the First World War?
No, Prussia's always been a part of Germany.
No,
Prussia
I mean
was the key part of Germany.
I mean now it isn't. So when did it stop being part of it?
We mean Berlin is in Prussia.
There's no Prussia anymore.
No, but I mean, that's because Prussia unified as Germany. So what I mean is, okay, you're right. The Prussia stops existing when Wilhelm becomes Kaiser, because they got rid of Prussia because he is now the emperor of Germany. So Prussia is Germany. But Prussia still exists.
Yeah, yeah, I got that. I mean, afterwards, when did it stop being there? Because the land where Prussia was now is Poland and stuff. There's no Prussia today.
Oh well, that all comes about at the end of World War II, actually.
Oh really?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
It has to do with treaties at the end of World War II, particularly as punishment because the Germans' invasion of Poland and Warsaw that brought the British in and the French into the war.
Oh, okay.
So I apologize, I misunderstood what you were asking there.
Yeah.
How are your parents?
Oh, they're fine again. Yeah, they're healed or whatever.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
So the video yesterday that you did, you said there was a problem.
I have not put it online yet. I apologize. I ran into an issue and I had to send a help request to Zoom, and I haven't heard back from them yet in converting it. So hopefully I'll hear back from them this afternoon and I'll have it up there tonight.
Okay.
So I apologize for that. Any other questions?
Oh,
How's quarantine going?
So far so good. Going a little bit stir crazy, but other than that.
Yeah.
How about with you? Saw you at Walmart once.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I'm not doing that much. It's kind of boring.
Yeah. Are you still living with Trinity and her family?
Yes.
I walk past that house a couple times a day doing my daily exercise. So if you see me out, say hi.
Yeah, we saw you once, in the evening, and we honked at you, but you didn't wave back.
Oh, I probably, because I listen to my radio show with my headphones. Yeah. I can't really hear anything else. So when I'm
walking, I saw that.
I got a little bit spooked yesterday when I walked past yesterday evening, because there were like these giant eyes staring at me, and I realized it's the dude from Pirates of the Caribbean.
Oh yeah, that's like in my host brother's room.
Oh, I was like, okay.
Yeah.
Josh, are you still up Chicago?
Yeah, I'm still up here.
Are things going okay there?
Yeah, no problem.
Good.
I woke up this morning. There's snow on the ground.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Well, it's chilly here, but it's in the, low 50s. So no snow here.
It was like 60 last week, so I'm really confused.
I know. Yeah, the same here. Matter of fact, it got up to in the 70s last week.
Holy cow.
All right, guys. Well, I'm going to cut it short and go get some lunch. So hopefully I'll see you back tomorrow. And I want to say I'm not a grade person. So I've never, I don't do the job for the grades. I do it for the learning. So I want to say thank you for still wanting to invest in the learning and giving me purpose here in the teaching, because I sure enjoy the teaching of this and talking about this stuff. So I appreciate you wanting to invest in your own knowledge and being here to learn, even though there's no incentive for you to do so per se. All right, I'll talk to you guys tomorrow then, hopefully.
All right.
Yes.
Bye.
See you later.
Bye.